last couple of weeks, we've had a refresher on recent changes to Michigan's auto no-fault and liability insurance laws. But what about other kinds of optional auto insurance coverages? And what are they? And what should you consider to protect you and your family? Here to explain the basics of uninsured motorist coverage is attorney Tom Sinas on the Sinas Dramus Law Firm. Thanks again for joining us. And of course, this is something that's definitely important to point out for people here in West Michigan.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. I'm glad we have a chance to talk about this.
Absolutely. So let's go ahead and dive right into this. So when it comes to auto insurance, what is the difference between mandatory and optional coverages?
It is a really good question, because mandatory really refers to those coverages that people are required to have by law in order to legally drive. There are certain kinds of coverages you have to have in different states in order to legally operate a car. Some people use the phrase PLPD. You hear that phrase used sometimes. It's kind of a loose term that doesn't really specifically refer to any one state law. In our state, we have really three kinds of mandatory insurance coverages. The first are auto no-fault benefits, like we talked about the last couple of weeks. The second is benefits or coverage for property damage. And the third is liability coverage, which we also talked about recently. So you can have a valid insurance policy and legally drive and have only those mandatory minimum coverages. But as you alluded to, there are other coverages that people really should give strong consideration to that are not mandatory. They're optional, but just because they're optional doesn't mean it's something that you should skip over.
Okay. So what is uninsured motorist coverage, and when should you apply for something like that?
Okay. This is a confusing phrase, uninsured motorist coverage. At least I've always found it confusing because you're talking about someone buying insurance coverage for themselves, and then you're asking them, well, do you want to buy uninsured motorist coverage? It seems a bit like an oxymoron. It's like, well, why would I need uninsured motorist coverage if I just bought insurance? And so I think a lot of people get confused, rightfully so, just at the name itself. But think of it in its most basic term this way. Uninsured motorist coverage is coverage that you can buy to protect you and your family from bad drivers who don't have insurance. So the uninsured motorist that you're protecting yourself from, of course, is not you. It is the other driver that may cause a crash that you may be involved in. And uninsured motorist coverage is really coverage that stands in the place of the liability coverage that other driver didn't have. So let's say you and I are involved in a crash. And let's just say I didn't have insurance, liability insurance. If the crash is my fault, you have a claim against me. You have that liability claim that we've talked about before. But if I have no liability insurance, I'm an uninsured motorist. So if you purchased uninsured motorist coverage, that coverage that you purchased stands in the place of the liability coverage that I never had. So that's the basic concept. There are other scenarios where uninsured motorist coverage applies that may be less obvious, but are maybe equally important, like hit and run collisions. If someone's involved in a hit and run collision, nearly every uninsured motorist policy will define an uninsured motorist as the hit and run driver. Because of course, if somebody hits someone and flees the scene, you don't know who they are. Therefore, you don't know anything about their insurance. And so that falls under your uninsured motorist coverage. And as we've talked about over the years, hit and run accidents in West Michigan and throughout the state are unfortunately just an increasingly persistent problem. Other times, people can be involved in crashes with someone else who may appear to have insurance, but something could come up down the road where that other person's insurance says, we're not going to provide coverage to you. Well, if you're the victim on the other side of that case, if you purchase uninsured motorist coverage, that uninsured motorist coverage can stand in to protect you. This coverage is cheap. It's usually relatively inexpensive compared to the other types of coverage people buy. And you can select the level of coverage, the dollar amount of coverage that you want. But coming back to where we were before, it's optional. So you need to select for it, advocate for it, and buy as much of it as you can afford.
So bottom line, if people are involved in an accident with an uninsured motorist, what should they do?
Great question. First and foremost, call the police. It sounds really obvious, but you'd be surprised sometimes it doesn't happen. If you're involved in any type of car accident, obviously you can call the police, even if it's a hit and run accident, particularly if it's a hit and run accident. You also need to notify your insurance company. Some insurance policies have different rules regarding when you have to notify them if you're involved in a situation with an uninsured motorist. If you can do simple things like take photos of either the damage to your vehicle, if you can decipher who the other vehicle was, photos of that. In other words, document the claim and make sure that you notify your insurance company that you may have one of these claims. That's the first place to start. And then you really have to have an understanding of how this particular claim works under your insurance policy, which, for some people may be easier to decipher than others. And if you can't, if you feel like you don't want to go it alone there, and I don't generally recommend that you do, then it's a good time to consider maybe contacting someone who practices in this area of law.
All right. Well, with that said, where can people go for more information?
They can find us online at www.sinusdramus.com. They can shoot us an email at info@sinusdramus.com or give us a call in West Michigan at 616-301-3333.
Always great chatting with you. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.